Endocrine system, part 2. So now we've talked about all the different hormones. Let's classify them. So your classes, you've got your protein-based hormones and your lipid-based hormones. Your protein-based hormones, you have polypeptides, which are small proteins like insulin or ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Then you have glycoproteins, which are large proteins with a carbohydrate. Those are things like FSH and LH, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Then you have amines, and those are modified amino acids, like epinephrine and melatonin. Then in our lipid-based hormones category, you've got steroids, and they're modified cholesterols. When we talk about structure of atoms, you'd understand that more. Those are things like sex hormones and aldosterone. Those are steroids. So how do hormones act on target cells? Well, if you're a lipid-based hormone, like a steroid, then you're hydrophobic and lipid soluble. So you don't like water and you do like fat. You'll dissolve in fats. So it will be able to diffuse across the membrane and enter the cells. And then once it's in the cell, it binds to a receptor protein in the cytoplasm and the nucleus, and then it binds to DNA as a transcription factor and creates proteins. Then your protein-based hormones, the amines and other ones, are hydrophilic, they like water, and they're not lipid soluble. They won't be able to diffuse across the membrane, they're too big. And so instead they bind to a receptor protein that's on the cell membrane. Then what it does, once it's bound to the protein, it triggers the secondary messenger pathway, which is the cyclic AMP, also known as CAMP. You need to know that for the AP test. And then what that secondary messenger pathway does is it activates a cellular response, like enzyme action or uptake or secretion of molecules. So here's our action of our lipid or steroid hormones. Here it is, protein carrier in the blood, drops it out into here. The steroid comes across the membrane, hits a receptor protein. The receptor protein takes it into the nucleus, helps it writes some DNA, and then that DNA comes on out and creates a protein. Now, what do the protein hormones do? They come attached to this protein receptor on the membrane, and then it gives off a signal, this secondary messenger. It gives us this G protein, which activates this enzyme, which then produces CAMP, and then activates the enzyme, gives off some energy, keeps going here, but then it activates the next enzyme, which produces an action. You get this cascade of tasks. So here's an example. Comes on in, gives off this G protein, activates the adenyl cyclase, then CAMP gets into motion. It activates protein kinase A, which then activates phosphorylase, which then turns glycogen into glucose, which is then released back to the blood. So this 2-degree messenger system, the benefits of it are you get amplification. So here, one little guy comes, binds to a receptor protein, gives off all these G proteins. Then these G proteins come and bind with these receptor proteins that are on the inside of the cell membrane. Then once they're bound, they give off CAMP. So they give off all this CAMP. And then each CAMP gives off a protein kinase. And then each kinase gives off an enzyme. And then each enzyme gives off an enzymatic product. And it just gets bigger and bigger every time. So one little hormone gives off all of this, and that's for every single one of these. So you'll notice how it gets really big all of a sudden. So that's amplification with our 2-degree system. All right, finally, the female reproductive cycle, you can see how it's kind of ruled by hormones. We've got GnRH, then FSH and LH, estrogen, progesterone, HCG. So this is our feedback loop for the female reproductive cycle. And our next lecture will be on the reproductive cycle itself. So we'll talk about what this looks like.